Now we can turn to 1948, the Nakba, the mass expulsion of Palestinians to create the Jewish state. What is the Nakba? What did that entail? And how did it lead to the creation of Israel and Palestine as we know it?
Yeah, so the Nakba is probably the single most important event, at least before 2023, in Palestinian history. It was the word itself just means catastrophe. It is used to describe the ethnic cleansing of 750,000 Palestinians in 1948. And so, just to back up a little bit, the British, they have occupied Palestine in 1920 and established this mandate for Palestine that lasts until 1948. And basically, they decide after almost 30 years of colonial rule that this project has failed. It's time to go back home. And basically they declare that they're going to leave Palestine. And so and then the United Nations adopts this the partition plan in 1947, in November 1947, and immediately after that plan is proposed, you see violence between Jews and Palestinians in Palestine, kind of a civil war from November 1947 until the war lasts until almost the end of 1948, really November, December 1948, and it's during that period of time from November 1947 up until let's say November 1948, in which the Zionist forces first they adopt a plan. It's called Plan Dalet, and that plan is basically a blueprint for establishing a Jewish state. And how do you establish a Jewish state in a land that is majority non-Jewish? Well, you remove the Arabs. And that was quite explicit in the plan. It was anyone is hostile to the Zionist forces who go town to town in February, March, April, and May of 1940. They're going town to town. They're expelling Palestinians from their homes. You get 40,000 Palestinians expelled from Lid in 1948. There's massacres in Tantura on the coast. Then in the Galilee in the fall of 48, they go up and expel hundreds of thousands of more Palestinians into Lebanon and Syria. So basically, the Nakba it's not only the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, but also the entire destruction of Palestinian society. Remember, it wasn't just that they expelled the Palestinians from their homes. It was that then they destroyed the villages so they couldn't come back to them. And then on top of that, they destroyed 500 Palestinian villages during the war. And then I think really the real kicker is that after the war ended, they continued to expel more Palestinians from their homes. It wasn't like the war ended, okay, peace with the Palestinians. No. They continued to expel something like 36 more Palestinian villages were depopulated after November 1948. So in other words, after the war ended. And then in the 2 years following the end of the war, so basically from the end of 1948 until 1950, you had all these Palestinian refugees trying to come home. Right? As refugees so often do. At the end of a war, you go home. And in their attempts to go home, they were overwhelmingly unarmed. They were trying to reclaim property, trying to reclaim lost land, trying to see family, trying to reclaim animals, harvest crops in some cases. More than 1,000 unarmed Palestinians were slaughtered in the year after the war, in the 1 to 2 years after the war. So I think this is why it was such a catastrophe, because not only do you have so many massacres during the war, not only do you have 750,000 Palestinians become refugees during the war, but then you have many thousands of Palestinians massacred even after the war itself.
Yeah, I mean it's no, the Nakba, my producer Matt just said it's a continuous and present process. That's I think a great way to put it. Yeah, it's very eerie, right? What we're witnessing at this current moment, and the exact tactics that you described there. So the Nakba happens 1948. The partition plan goes into place. The next kind of real milestone is based on, you're the historian, but based on my understanding, is the 1967 borders, which Israel has been in violation of for decades at this point. That really marks the moment where Israel decided we are not gonna comply with kind of like any international boundaries set to try to contain this process. What happens in 1967 and after?
Yeah, so the June 1967 war, a war that you could say was a culmination of tension between, let's say, Egypt and Israel, as well as Syria and Israel, and Jordan and Israel. And this boils over into a war in which Israel conquers and occupies Gaza, Sinai, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem. And within a few weeks of the war's end, Israel annexes a massive swath of the West Bank, something like 70 or 80 square kilometers of basically the West Bank. It now calls East Jerusalem so that it can annex it. Within 2 weeks of the war's end, so we're talking June 18th, 19th, 1967, the Israeli cabinet makes a number of critical decisions. Number one, they decide that the eastern border with Jordan, so basically the Jordan River, is now Israel's eastern border. And that, which essentially means Israel made the decision to permanently occupy the West Bank indefinitely. They made that decision 2 weeks after the war ended. Okay, not even, maybe it was less than 1 week. They also decide that they don't really want Sinai, but they do want Gaza. And eventually they make this. This is incredible that they literally. This was a decision made in 56 years ago. The Israeli cabinet decided, we want to annex Gaza, but we need to figure out a way of expelling its residents first. That was a cabinet discussion. That was a decision that was made in June 1967. So, basically the decision was made. We want the land. We don't want the people that live on it. That's a very important thing for the Zionists, right? You want the land because Zionism is all about Jewish flourishing, Jewish self-determination, Jewish prosperity, right? Well, how do you prosper and flourish? Well, you conquer more land and you settle more people on it. This is all, especially the kind of the historic homeland of the ancient Israelite kingdom, right? Judea and Samaria, right? So this is very much like part of the core of Zionism is kind of settling the land. So you got to conquer it, then you occupy it, and then you settle it. And what do you do with the Palestinians? Well, if you can expel them, great. If you can't expel them, well, push them into smaller and smaller areas. Crowd them into, push them from Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, get them out of that land because that's the area Israel wants, push them onto Area A and B, which is only 40% of the West Bank, and then in Gaza, just keep crowding them into smaller and smaller areas, create a buffer zone, create Israeli settlements separating North Gaza from South Gaza. And that's basically what we've seen over the past 56 years.
So how much territory did Israel take in like the immediate aftermath of 1967 in violation again of the international borders drawn? And then when did like the West Bank and Gaza as the respective ghetto and open air prison of Palestinian people, / concentration camp, when did those kind of modern borders come to be?
Yeah, so in the immediate aftermath of the war, Israel, like I said, they annexed something like 70 square kilometers of the West Bank. They annexed it to Jerusalem and called it East Jerusalem, even though those villages were actually not part of Jerusalem before that period of time. And then they basically decide they're going to occupy Gaza and the West Bank indefinitely. And essentially, over the course of the 1960s and 70s, start to implement processes and procedures, and then you get the permit regime, and then you get the closure regime. But basically, it's a 56-year-long history of confiscating more land. Something like, I don't recall the exact figures, but a vast majority of the settlements are actually built on privately owned Palestinian land. So you confiscate land in various ways. The most popular way by the 1980s was declaring it state land. So first you declared state land, and then you build settlements on it. And then in many cases you have to push Palestinians off that land to build those settlements. In certain cases, the Israeli army even used chemical weapons. They poisoned a well, and they poisoned wells in the 1970s because they wanted to build an Israeli settlement. I believe it was near Salfit in the West Bank. But in any case, so Israel is conquering, confiscating land, demolishing homes. They are stripping Palestinians of residency rights, pushing them. So, for example, in East Jerusalem, 15,000 Palestinians have been stripped of their right to live in East Jerusalem. Why? Well, because they're born of the wrong religion and of the wrong nationality. That's basically the reason. And the same is true in the West Bank and Gaza. Over the, basically from 1967 until 1987, they expelled 2,000 Palestinians from the occupied territories to outside. The same happens in the 90s. They try and expel 400 members of Hamas fighters. Hamas is carrying out all these attacks, and so they're like, oh, we know the solution. Let's expel all of Hamas to South Lebanon. By the way, that is a very tragic mistake on their part, because what ends up happening is Hamas and Hezbollah.
I was just about to say, how predictable. They join Hezbollah in Lebanon. Jesus Christ.
It's like exactly what happened with when the U.S. created all these prisons in Iraq after 2003, and basically it created these breeding grounds for ISIS in Iraq. The same is true with Israel. They push all these Palestinians out of Israel into Lebanon, or out of the occupied territories into Lebanon. And lo and behold, you have this kind of newfound alliance between Hamas and Hezbollah,
which that is convenient also for Israel, by the way. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. So basically, it's a 56-year-long history of taking over more land, destroying more Palestinian homes, destroying Palestinian olive groves, expelling Palestinians from out of the occupied territories, stripping them of their residency status, denying them the right to family reunification, denying them the freedom of movement, denying them the right to vote for the government that controls their lives, i.e. the Israeli military, imposing a military regime on them that has a conviction rate in the military courts of 99.7%. I mean, that is life for Palestinians for 56 years.
Yeah, I mean, and when you say that the number 56 years over and over again, I mean that is so important to note, because that has been the reality up until this point. When we're continuously talking about October 7th, I mean, it's purely based, really, on the poverty and the deprivation of the Palestinian people and the extreme amount of arms and weaponry and wealth that is sent to Israel, and propped up by, and also nuclear weapons, by the way, most likely. And that has made it so that, like, that's the deadliest attack in 56 years of occupation and seizure of land and deprivation of rights and mowing the lawn. That's all that happened. I mean, that is almost a minor miracle that more Israelis have not been killed in this way.
I think that, I mean, if you go back to 1948, 1956, and look at how it is that this organization Hamas even came about, right? In 1948, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas, he was expelled from his home at age 12. The other founder, the other co-founder of Hamas, Abdulaziz Rantisi, in 1956, when he was an 8-year-old boy in the Khan Yunis refugee camp in Gaza, the Israeli army, in their neo-colonial war together with Britain and France, they reoccupy Gaza. They occupy the Gaza Strip. They enter the Khan Yunis camp on November 3rd, 1956, grab every male above the age of 15, line them up in the city center, and execute them. It was a massacre. 150 to 200 Palestinians were massacred. He bore witness to that. As an 8-year-old boy, his uncle was massacred. Lo and behold, 20 years later, in the case of Abdulaziz Rantisi, and in the case of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, something more like 30 or 40 years later, they found the organization that carried out the attack on October 7th. So, I mean, just imagine how many 12-year-old boys have been made homeless. How many 8-year-old girls are witnessing the horrific violence, 30,000 Palestinians slaughtered in 3 months, the starvation now that is setting in. We're talking about the Israeli army using starvation as a weapon of war right now. You're talking mass displacement, mass suffering, overcrowded shelters, diseases spreading rampantly. I mean, how many of the kids in Palestine today are going to grow up with the hatred that is going to lead them to carry out all kinds of attacks against Israel in the future? I mean, my goodness, how could they not? I mean, what is Israel doing right now? It's setting itself up for decades and decades more violence. I mean, it's just so tragic thinking about kind of what is, it's what has happened is tragic. Thinking about what will happen in the future is just, it's honestly difficult to even comprehend.
Yeah. I mean, and we don't even know updated death tolls right now, because the entire health system in Gaza has completely collapsed. Their ability, and the ministry too, their ability to get anything out there. I mean, the rolling blackouts, it's been over a week of communication blackouts. We don't know. I go by Euromed Monitor numbers because they also count the presumed dead in their figures, but even the 25,000 dead number that are confirmed by like morgues and hospitals, that's not the full figure, but it's also going to be higher, the official death toll, soon, because the counting isn't even able to proceed in any way right now. Like we are witnessing, let alone the people that are going to be maimed and never be the same for the rest of their lives based on the injuries that they've suffered and the family that they have lost. I guess, I'll wrap up here with you, Zach, just because I kind of want to bring us to the present day. Tomorrow we will get the ICJ injunction essentially ruling, which is just the first the first kind of like emergency measure put in place if they're going to do it as they go over the next few years and look into South Africa's genocide case against Israel. One of the refrains you'll hear from Zionists about the case for the genocide case is like, oh, well, look at this population explosion. I mean, you can't be genociding a people when their population continues to increase. Now, putting aside the obvious, I think, rebuttal to that, which is that South Africa isn't actually contending that the genocide began before October 7th. They were contending that the ethnic cleansing and the conditions before the act of genocide began set up the genocide that is happening right now. But even so, that straw man about the population increase, as a historian of Palestine, what's your response to that?
Anybody who talks about population increases in a conversation about genocide is actually telling you they don't know what the legal definition of genocide is, according to the United Nations Genocide Convention of 48. That's what they're saying, right? Because it's there are 5 things that this convention defines as acts of genocide, right? So acts to commit with intent to destroy in whole or part a group, including killing members of the group, causing them serious bodily harm, right? So, and then of course declaring your intent. Intent is very important. You have to declare intent. Another condition, another one of the 5 acts would be making basically conditions of life, conditions that basically where you can't live. When you describe what the Genocide Convention calls a genocide, and then you look at what Israel is doing in Gaza, it's a textbook case of genocide,
Exactly.
according to Israeli scholar Raz Siegel. Literally, intent. How many pages of the ICJ case included statements made by senior Israeli political and military officials, starting from the prime minister, comparing the enemy to Amalek, the biblical people that the Israelites were instructed to destroy every man, woman, child, and ox of. You have the prime minister state not once but twice the enemy the enemy is Amalek, meaning you need to kill every single man, woman, and child. How much more direct evidence of intent to commit a genocide do you need? This is a textbook case. So you have the intent, then you obviously have making conditions of life impossible. So complete siege. There's hundreds of thousands.
The births part, preventing births, the hospital attacks, the NICU babies decomposing. There's 5 planks of that Article 2, and Israel clearly meets 4 of them.
Exactly right. So I don't know what the ICJ will, how the ICJ will rule tomorrow. What I do know is that regardless of what term we use to describe this, it is among the most horrific acts we've ever seen in all of human history. We are looking at the complete destruction of an entire society. Something that people are describing. Not even World War II, not even the horrific scenes coming out of World War II are even comparable. We're talking about 90+% of the population made homeless. We're talking about, million+ people starving to death. As you and I have this conversation right now, 1 million+ people are starving to death.
Yep. I think the problem is just like the Zionists, defenders of the Israeli government, aren't even contending with facts. They're operating from a might meets right kind of perspective. And for someone who's geriatric like Joe Biden and who cites Golda Meir as somebody who he deeply admires, and how her conversation with him back in the Senate in 1973 changed his perspective forever, it's like, okay, so we're on sentimentality, we're on raw emotion, we're on a false kind of misguided desires to have reparations for the Holocaust at the expense of another population. These figures seem to be not getting home to people, and that's what's maddening. That's what's maddening. But
yeah, I mean, 100 days after October 7th, the president of the United States issues a statement in support and in sympathy with the Israeli victims and the Israeli victims only. I mean, the disconnect. Does he understand that 80% of young Americans call for a ceasefire? Does he understand that the 5 to 10 million American Muslims and Arabs are not going to vote for someone who's carrying on a genocide against the Palestinian people? Does he have any idea what he's doing? I mean, for his own self-interest, leaving aside the Palestinians.
I don't know. Yeah, you're preaching to the choir here, Zach. But I really, if the audience hasn't gotten the sense already, Zach's newsletter is really important work, and archiving all of this is so essential. It's called the Palestine Nexus newsletter. You can sign up for it. You can read some of those documents that Zach outlined there for free on the website as well. We'll put a link to Palestine Nexus in the description wherever you're listening to or watching this. Zachary Foster, really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much, and I hope to have you on again soon.
Thanks so much for having me, Emma.